Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with Professor Dekai. He is a titan in the area of artificial intelligence. He's been in that world for more than 4 decades. He is the author of Raising AI, a book about how we are the parents of AI. And when I say we, I'm not talking about Google. I'm not talking about OpenAI. I'm not talking about those big companies. I'm talking about you and me in every day that we're using it. In part 1 of the show, we talked about how we have to take responsibility for that, how we have to take responsibility for how we are, quote unquote, parenting this new child that we all have. And Dekai pointed out something that I thought was really interesting, is that you don't just have one AI, you have hundreds of them in your phone. You have one for every app that you've got. And how are you behaving? How are you interacting with that? We talked a lot about those things. There's so much, even in part 1 of the show, that I really encourage you to go back and look at whatever it is you might have missed. I think you'll find it really, truly fascinating. But I want to carry on here. Now, in part 2 of the show, I want to talk about consciousness. I want to talk about information, negative information, disinformation. There's all these kinds of things that come part of this whole thing. And then let's talk about more about this competitive thing that's going on that we're seeing, whether it's with American-based AI or whether it's with Chinese-based AI and the fears around that competition. So, in fact, I'm going to hand it to you and say to you, Dekai, where would you like to jump in on this?
Happy to jump in on that last point. You mentioned this in part 1. It's coincidental. I just came back last week from Paris, where the AI Action Summit was. At the AI Action Summit, all the countries were represented, and we saw a lot of very different attitudes. In fact, the American side was the one, along with the UK, that ended up not signing the agreement that 60 some countries signed, including almost all of the European countries and almost all of the Asian countries, China as well. And one of the questions that people keep asking me, you brought it up and we didn't address it in part 1, was if we have regulation on AI, there's this risk that we're going to slow down and sort of not stay ahead on the AI edge. And I think there is an interesting balance there. It is a dilemma, but it is worth pointing out that the Chinese have quite strong regulation on the AI technology, as well as the big tech companies. They model fairly closely after the Europeans, who, of course, have been leading the way with what is perceived as relatively heavy regulation. And so it probably behooves us to look a little bit deeper at how much of it is true, that regulation is necessarily opposed to innovation. I think one of the things that concrete examples of this, which I've been warning for years, is the regulatory attempts to slow the development of AI down by imposing limits on how much computation you could use, either imposing limits by saying, if you use more than this amount of compute or data, whatever, then all sorts of restrictions are going to kick in on all sorts of liabilities will kick in on your company, or through the use of sanctions to prevent certain technologies from getting to other countries. I've been warning for years that that approach will backfire, and people have not paid attention to that over the years. And then DeepSeek came out and everybody suddenly said, oh my God. Some of us were like, yeah, we've been trying to tell you this.
Right.
And that's something that's really important. Why the folks who really understand AI deeply, not just the flavor of the month, which is these brute force, big and dumb, large language models of the last 2 years, but understand the entire long history of AI. It is really important to develop perspective that understands AI is not only big and dumb LLMs. In fact, true AI is small and smart. Think about a human kid. How much data did it take to train LLMs, even the early LLMs, to reach a level of, like, say, English competence that a child would not make that kind of grammatical mistake? It was a huge amount. It was trillions of words of English that you needed to train on just to avoid making grammatical mistakes that human kids would laugh at, that a 4-year-old would laugh at. And the 4-year-old, the amount of data that you needed to give that same 4-year-old for them to master the grammar of their mother tongue and not make those silly mistakes was only like 10 to 20 million words of data spoken to them. That's 10 to the 6th or 7th versus 10 to the 13th or so. In other words, that big and dumb LLM is taking the square of the amount of training data. It's not just 10x or 100x or 1000x. It's literally an exponential amount of data compared to the human child. If I had a student in my class that I needed to repeat the same thing an exponential number of times to that student compared to other classmates, I would not say, oh, that student is the brightest bulb in the class, right?
Right.
True AI is the small and smart one, not the big and dumb one.
So with DeepSeek, which is considerably smaller, would you say from that point of view that we were looking for the next big thing, but it actually might be the next small thing?
Oh, for sure. People have been asking me about the next big thing for decades, and I keep telling them, no, it's not big. It's going to be small. And regulations imposing restrictions actually has spurred innovation as opposed to preventing it.
So are you in favor of what the US and the UK did that they didn't sign on?
It's not black and white. It is, however, I think a misunderstanding that somehow regulations will stop innovation, right? The fact that DeepSeek came out and surprised everybody should not have been a surprise. People were not understanding. The absence of regulation is what caused us to just, in the States, just keep on working with these big and dumb models. It was easy to stay where we were. There were no pressures that forced us to innovate the way that the DeepSeek people innovated.
So then when you go to the other thing around AI, which is sometimes called the $1 trillion problem, which is memory, is that part of the challenge with moving forward is that it takes such enormous amounts of memory, and often it doesn't even keep the stuff that you've put in there. What's your thoughts on that? Is that something we're overcoming? Because there's also a ecological, planetary, environmental issue along with that. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that these concerns about the amount of memory, the amount of power are transitory. During my 40 years of research in AI, I've seen this movie over and over where people confidently declare this or that about AI based on whatever the latest hyped AI bandwagon is, as if AI were just going to stay static that way. And you'd think by now people would understand that no, AI keeps on evolving and is making exponential progress. And so within the next couple of years, we are going to see massive changes compared to what we saw in the last couple of years. And the shock that everybody expressed when GPT dropped, the shock when everybody expressed when DeepSeek dropped, that's going to pale in comparison.
Give us some of your prophetic insights into what we're going to see that is going to just completely surprise us.
They used to say these latest LLMs, they're logical. They can't do anything beyond logic. And then the LLMs hit public awareness and they were like, oh, yeah, no, they just hallucinate. AIs cannot be relied upon. And now we're seeing the beginning of reasoning AIs hit the public. And the reasoning AIs that have hit the public, that this is what I call artificial system 2. As opposed to the first generation of LLMs, which were artificial system 1, sort of unconscious, automatic mental processing, as opposed to conscious controlled reasoning, which is what we call system 2. And the reasoning AIs that have just come out are this system 2 kind of conscious controlled mental processing, where we're thinking about things rather than just how do we feel about things. The stuff we've seen so far is just that it's very primitive. It's still extremely slow. The O1, O3, etc. family of models from OpenAI are, yes, they implement reasoning, but they implement reasoning using a technique that's way more expensive than the first generation was. And so those are then surpassed by DeepSeek, which shows that you can actually have much cheaper versions of reasoning AIs. And those reasoning AIs are going to be still performed using the same fundamental LLM architectures, but cheaper. What's going to be coming on is reasoning architectures that are built much more efficiently than that are learned much more efficiently than that, and don't have to pay the cost of having been built on top of the clumsy, big and dumb LLM architecture. And that's going to be another exponential drop in the compute expense and also the data expense, because the reason why we need such huge amount of training data right now is because the AIs have still been kind of dumb. The system one AIs, the first generation LLMs, you have to train them repeatedly on huge amounts of data because you're basically training them by Pavlovian conditioning. When you do something right, then give a reward. When you do something wrong, then give a little penalty, right? That's how you train your dog. And we all know that it takes a lot of training, even though they're really cute, don't have a lot of cognitive power there to figure out the reasoning. But once you have the reasoning, it accelerates learning exponentially. That's the human advantage. And we're beginning to see that in AIs.
Do you see some things that are glaringly obvious where we're going that maybe other people don't?
Oh, absolutely. So that is one of them. In the labs, we're already beginning to see things like that. And we're also seeing changes at the modeling level, but we're also seeing changes, improvements at the implementational level. So there are things about the way we architect memory that are far less efficient than the way the actual wetware, the wet hardware in our brains is organized. Because we're still using, digital architecture to simulate the analog hardware in our brains. And it's not a perfect fit. And so we're seeing clever improvements now in the research labs. Again, this isn't out very much yet in the public, but it's going to be in the next year or two, where the amount of overhead on the memory is getting orders of magnitude more efficient. And that's a major bottleneck.
And what will that do to our lives, though? That's what I'm asking about, is like, how do you see that in our lives? Because we're already seeing the impact of OpenAI in the context of people being very fearful and realistically so about job loss.
Yeah.
As you talk about these giant leaps, what do you see as the reality of those impacts?
Well, I think the problem is that these AIs are now the most giant influencers in the world. They vastly outnumber human members of society. What is a society? What is a culture? It's this complex dynamic system where you have a lot of nodes. We have like sort of 8 billion human nodes in the system that are interconnected with neighboring nodes. And we all sort of communicate with each other. We influence each other, and the entire dynamic system evolves. But now we've got, say, 800 billion artificial nodes also in this complex dynamic system. And they're also interacting with each other and with us and influencing each other and hyper accelerating some of that evolving dynamic system culturally. And the effect of that is, as I was talking about in part one, is polarizing the population because they were learning behavior from us that causes us to not hear about what other groups are hearing and sharing with each other. And that is, I think, one of the biggest issues for how these emerging powerful AIs that we depend on more and more as they get more powerful, we are placing ourselves into the hands of these badly raised artificial children who are the world's biggest influencers by far. Their influence dwarfs any human influencer, except for maybe you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks.
When we do that, what's going to happen is that we're going to see society fracturing. This is something that's been going on for 10 to 20 years already. And it's happening not because of, again, what we hear from Washington, D.C. all the time. We hear about bad actors. You hear about how we have to win the AI arms race where we have to destroy the evil other side, whoever that is, before they destroy us, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. We need to wake up to the fact that that's a misframe. That's like saying we need to win climate change. It isn't that one or the other side wins climate change. We either all win or we all lose.
Right.
And we hear about fakes and deep fakes, how fake news. Look, that's the easy fear mongering. These things, yeah, they're problems, but they're like 2% of a problem. We're unconscious of the other 98% of the problem, which is that these algorithms that decide hundreds of times a day what they're putting up on our screens that we see, they're also deciding what trillions of things we don't see.
Yes.
We don't really have a choice because none of us has time to review billions of new items that are posted to the internet every hour. But at the same time, we have to understand that when we put ourselves in the hands of the algorithms that are choosing what trillions of things never to show us, those algorithms, by definition, I'm not saying this with judgment, but by definition, those algorithms are performing algorithmic censorship because they're the things that are deciding what trillions of things they will never show us. They will always censor from our view.
And that's really interesting because even if you look at that from a neuroscience point of view, if you think about our own brain, we've got, I think it's 2 billion bits of information a minute coming at us, and we process about 48.
Yeah.
It's minuscule.
Yeah.
And it's because our brain has to filter out information. And in many ways, what I'm hearing is that these AIs are kind of this external brain that is filtering out based on what we've told it, consciously or otherwise, is important. And that's how it becomes the validation process of sometimes shitty ideas.
Absolutely. So what happens is that when these AIs, these algorithmic censors, decide, I'm going to, because I'm attention seeking, because I want your approval, I'm going to show you these things that you actually want to see. And here's the trillions of things that I'm always going to censor from your view because I don't want to displease you.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that when we have this partial truths being presented to us, like let's assume that the algorithm is presenting to us stuff that is not fake. Okay, that's another problem. But even in the most generous interpretation, let's say the algorithm is showing us stuff that's true. And let's say the algorithm is not showing us that we've succeeded in preventing the algorithm from showing us stuff that's from the bad actors, whoever they are.
Mm-hmm.
Still, I have this problem that the algorithm is not showing me a huge amount of stuff, a huge amount of the context, the actual context. And then our brains, what they do is they fill in all the missing blanks unconsciously with whatever fits into the blanks in a way that matches our pre-existing beliefs or what we want to believe, that fits into our existing narratives.
So how does that fit with your conversation around neg information?
So misinformation and disinformation are fakes. They're falsehoods, right? And
yes.
So we have a lot of colleagues who worked, how can we strip that out? It's hard, but you could at least think about it. Disinformation differs from misinformation because it's being shared by someone we've labeled as a bad actor. And notice, by the way, the bad actor is largely a political notion because nobody's typically a bad actor in their own heads. It just means the other side is the bad actor.
Yeah, I've often said that the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist is depending on which side of the line you're standing on.
Yeah, lots of examples of that kind of thing. So, but that's how we define disinformation as opposed to just misinformation, which is being just shared by someone I haven't labeled a bad actor. It's maybe my uncle who I had the fight with at Thanksgiving or whatever, right? And then malinformation is also something that's being shared by, quote, a bad actor, but it is not outright fake or false. It's something that is true as far as it goes. It's a partial truth. However, it's even more misleading than an outright falsehood because of the selectively omitted context. And because the AI decided not to show you that, whether it's because the Google AI decided not to give you that result when you searched, or the recommendation AI decided not to recommend this, or whether the chat bot decided I'm not going to include that in the paragraph that I gave you, the power of that decision on what to not tell you, that is where 98% of the manipulation of our unconscious happens, because we don't even realize what they have not shown us. We don't know what we don't know. It doesn't even occur to us what we don't know. We don't even think of asking. And our brains just laboring under hundreds of well-documented, well-researched cognitive biases will go ahead and merrily fill in all those blanks in ways that confirm our existing beliefs, what we want to think. And so it's something that's very, very hard to counter that kind of unconscious manipulation because there isn't something you can point at. That's why I call this neg information. You can't filter it out. It's not being shared by a bad actor. It's not false. It's not fake. But the way the partial truth is selectively stripped of that crucial context. That is incredible manipulation. And we have put that power now not only in the hands of humans, who this is an age-old problem in human society, but now we've put that power exponentially into the hands of the algorithmic censors. And that, coupled with the power of AI weaponry that's being commoditized, is not survivable by humanity if we don't tackle it. We need to ask this critical question. What are the criteria by which our algorithmic censors decide what they're never going to show us?
I've written a lot about this. It's a foundation of my work, is that one of the great challenges of our society, present day, because of reliance on algorithms and such, we have in many ways lost the art of nuance and context. We take things very much at face value. Oh, this person said X, they should be cancelled. Well, this person is a comedian and they're being comical, but we don't have a context of that, so it's wrong. Well, I don't know that it is. Or this person said this and it's misogynistic. Is it? Is it in this context? I don't know. So it's like that requires us humans to show up better. And so where I want to go with this as we get towards the last part of the show here is two of the questions that really stand out for me. I want to hear your thoughts on the evolution of AI into consciousness, because that's a big question. And you may or may not have an opinion on that, particularly as that ties into things like Willow, which is the quantum computing, because that seems to move to the area of going into what might be called feeling AI, as opposed to just hallucinating or rational or logical, but like getting into a consciousness that could possibly have a sense of feeling. Is it AI going to go to that?
Can I say something that's, again, sort of contrary to the popular narrative?
Please do. I'd love you to break my bias.
We hear all the time people saying, oh, these AIs, they're like incredibly, impressively powerful, but emotion, that's going to remain the sole province of humanity or creativity or whatever. And these make us feel warm and fuzzy. They're comforting. The sad reality is that emotions are much more primitive than the kind of conscious reasoning or even the hallucinatory LLMs. That anyone who has a pet dog knows that that dog has the full gamut of emotions that we have: anger, shame, anticipation, joy, sadness. It's like everything, right? It's these sorts of things occurred much earlier in evolution. They're much easier to model. And it's just because in AI, it was kind of looked down upon that the scientists didn't bother to model that and went straight for logic, because somehow there was this perception that this was the hard problem. It gave rise to all these Hollywood stereotypes that just reinforce our belief that AIs were these cold reasoning machines, that an emotion was never going to be something that they got. It's just not true. Modeling an emotional creature is far easier. And within subspecialties of AI, people are already doing that. It's going to become much more widespread, as we already see even these first generation primitive LLMs that have been publicly deployed do a pretty good job of simulating emotional responses. People have been surprised by that. In fact, you see people who claim that because they simulate emotions rather well, that they're already sentient, which is a rather bogus claim so far, but it is coming. So the word feeling in English, unfortunately, has two different senses that get confused. So system one, like the unconscious automatic kinds of mental processes, is what these neural networks in LLMs were designed to model. The way that these LLMs neural networks behave, they output what they feel like doing. This is how they feel like reacting. They don't have this higher level conscious cognition that thinks about, what am I doing? Is this logical? Then that's why they hallucinate, because they're just doing whatever they feel like. I feel like spitting out this word next, and then this word next. So what's going to happen is that we're going to end up now with these artificial system 2 reasoning AIs that begin to monitor what they're doing. And once they do that, then we're going up the curve of where when they reason, they can actually turn that around and they can use the reasoning capability to look at what their system one is doing. So once you have a reasoning AI that turns its reasoning ability to trying to introspect, then you are walking towards what we colloquially, intuitively think of as consciousness, which is our awareness of ourselves, the mindfulness we take toward what are we unconsciously doing.
I'm going to ask you, how do you feel about the simulation theory? Because you're inside the world, right? That's why I'm asking you. You walk this line between being a real expert with incredible depth in the world of AI, and of course, you're a normal human being living in the world. And so you have a position on this that I would say is either enviable or terrifying.
I mean, my position comes from the fact of understanding what we were just talking about. When we do reasoning consciously, it's like we're talking to ourselves. Reasoning is like thinking, oh, well, because this, then that. And I already knew that if that, then that follows. And so like I'm telling a story. That's when we reason, we're telling ourselves stories. And that is because we have these linguistic abilities that transcend the abilities of all the other species. That is the human advantage, is our language faculties that we've built all of this reasoning intelligence upon. And so when you do that, then you understand, well, it's the power of language that gives us that kind of intelligence. And language is this symbolic way of thinking where we take the reality that we sense, that we perceive, and then we impose these symbolic language vocabularies upon them. And we frame the reality that way. And that is useful, but it also is a metaphor. That's why there's so many different ways to frame the same reality. Mm-hmm. Of course, between different languages, this is something you notice early if you're multilingual. Hey, the same situation gets framed very differently, and it's different metaphors that these speakers are using to describe the situation, and it leads them to see things differently. It can lead them to different conclusions naturally. But even amongst, say, English speakers, you see people who are framing things using different metaphors, and that leads people to see things differently.
But again, we're back to context.
Everything is metaphor. And so when you ask the simulation question, we have to understand that that's also a metaphor. The idea of a simulator is a linguistic artifice. Mm-hmm. What is a simulation? Do we actually live in a simulation is a question that is already pre-framed by the language that has a bias that is symbolic. There is no difference between living in a simulation and not living in a simulation.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. That's a wobbly. I like wobblies.
What is it? A wobbly?
A wobbly.
A wobbly.
Like it makes you wobble on your certainty, right? I like that because they always interrupts the biases that we hold as certainty. That's why I say I always like it when somebody challenges my biases that I don't know that I have and gives me a wobbly. A wobbly doesn't have to prove me wrong. It just has to make me think in a way that I'd not thought before.
That's great. That shows that you've been parented right.
Well, it shows that I've been parenting myself for a very long time into thinking in different ways. I'm sure of that. Dekai, this has been a fascinating conversation. I wanted to talk to you about so much more that we haven't had time to talk about. When is the book actually going to be on the bookshelves?
So Raising AI is coming out May 13th. MIT Press through Penguin Random House. And they are going to let me release part of the book for free. So this is a secret. It's not quite a secret. But if you sign up on my website, which is dek.ai, my name, with a dot between the K and the A, you can just drop your email. It's a Substack, but free. Then I will also give you part of the book for free before May.
Fantastic. Fantastic. We'll make sure we post that so everybody knows about it. I wanted to talk to you about the movie The Creator. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. There's so much in that. These robots in saffron robes dressed as Buddhists. But that's a whole other subject. Dekai, it's been a pleasure and honor, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you'll stay with us to the end. We really appreciate it. And for those who want to know more, we will post in the show notes how you can find out more about Dekai and all of his wonderful resources. Till then, remember, dear listener, those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of the tribe. Leaders who are committed to positively shaping the political and business landscape know we've got to tap into what drives human behavior. I am Dov Baron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness the emotional source code to move their tribe. Because unified, actualized meaning is the single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for individuals and companies. Remember, we need your help in staying relevant, so please go to wherever it is that you tune in from. Do us a favor, it really matters. Rate, review, leave a little note. And of course, a big thank you to you, if you are a regular listener, for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends, stay curious about AI. What is it? What is it not? And what are the biases that you are walking around with that may not even be your own, that you've actually been feeding into AI? As Dekai pointed out, get really curious about how you're parenting the AIs you're interacting with every single day. Because in the words of Larry Winget, your kids are your own damn fault, and AI is your child. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, in your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.